Okay, so one of the other big changes in the 1970s, as we've talked about in terms of the economic problems and the societal problems, is the reduction in the tensions because of the Cold War. One of the things that happens as a result of sort of these growing hostilities, the increased tensions that we talked about in the 1960s, is people are just becoming very fatigued with the Cold War. It's becoming something that is increasingly troubling to people. It's exhausting, this constant fear. So, by the 1970s, there's a reduction in the tensions that are existing because of the Cold War. Richard Nixon travels and meets with Leonid Brezhnev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union, and they start talking over something called the Strategic Arm Limitation Talks. So I have a copy of the treaty, one of the treaties that happens here, right? It's a Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And you can even see in sort of the preamble portion here, right? It talks about in terms of desiring to further the easing of international tensions and strengthen the trust between the states, right? So this is a treaty between the Soviet Union and the United States. I chose this because it's a really great description of sort of what's the goal here in reducing the tensions, recalling that in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, something that both of these, the Soviet Union and the United States, have signed. States must refrain in their international relations from the threat or the use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Okay, now I get it. This is something that's written as a goal. However, obviously what happens in practice is it might be a little different. But it is important to see that at least they're putting their names, their signatures to something about reducing these tensions. We call this the era of détente, right? This reduction of power that happens because of this constant threat that people are experiencing. So it's something that we discuss in terms of this, right? It's a French word, détente, reduction in power. There's also the SALT II talk, so Strategic Arm Limitation talk. We call these the SALT Treaties 1 and 2, 1972, and then the next one's in 1978. Now, the purpose of these meetings, these conversations, are again to reduce the amounts of warheads, right? And if you look at this, right, so 1972, you have sort of one of the first major, you have some drop, right? And then again in the late 1970s, further drops. Soviet Union's a little bit later, but again, it's important to notice that these reduced the tensions. So we'll talk about the Soviet Union dissolving when we look when we get to next week's class. But I do want to just look at some documents here that help us describe. Let's see if I can go to full screen here. That help describe the. Here we go. That describes sort of the problems people were experiencing during the Cold War, or at least during the 1970s, right? So I have a document that you'll be reading about this guy named Bob Mueller, who is a Vietnam vet, and he talks about sort of the questions he has about being in Vietnam, right? So if you look, right, he says Vietnam is something that you have to experience firsthand to believe, right? For me, knowledge of the fact that my government had seen fit to involve us militarily in Vietnam was sufficient for me. So that's why he went. I never asked the reason why. I just took it on blind faith that my government knew a hell of a lot more than I ever could. But then something changed. I never really asked, why were we in Vietnam? Boom. There's something you have to understand in a system like the military. Once you become a part of the machinery, it works on you. So he just becomes this sort of person who, as he says, wants to kill. But the question that he begins to ask is sort of, why are we there? What is it that is making us be there? And again, that's sort of the start of what people are questioning in the Cold War and by the 1970s. So those two things, right, this sort of fatigue of it, this desire to reduce our tensions, leads to these types of questions. For others, right, for women in particular, and again, this this document's a little early, 1963, but I also want to show you sort of, again, how culture here is changing and people are starting to question what it is that we are doing and why are we doing things, right? So Betty Friedan, who becomes a very famous feminist writer in the 1960s and 70s, writes a book called The Feminine Mystique. And this book is really an argument for sort of women's liberation. Now, in this book, she talks about how sort of women absorb this. The women in the 1950s, 60s, and arguably still today, they take a societal pressure that they must be sort of the housewife. They must take care of the family and do everything for the family. So she talks about the question that she asks, right? If you look here, as she made the beds, shopped the groceries, matched slip-cover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night, she was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all, right? So there's this growing idea in the 1960s again for women, right, to start asking the question, is this all, right? And that's sort of the feminine mystique, right? They sort of put on this mysterious mystique, this sort of this gown that they have to wear, and she, the afraid to even ask of herself, right? This idea that it's nerve-wracking to even ask, is this all? Okay, and then with Jimmy Carter becoming president in 1977 after the 1976 election, Carter comes to the presidency at a really interesting time, right? Think about the things going on in the 1970s, right? So you have this new economic crisis, you have the reduction in the American economy, the spike in the CPI. So inflation's going up, people are losing their jobs. You have the whole Watergate scandal, Nixon's forced to resign, Spiro Agnow's forced to resign, Gerald Ford had become the first president to never be elected. So people are really very concerned. So Carter becomes president, and he sort of needs to reassure people. The message he gives in his inaugural address is really one. He's a very religious man, still is a very religious man, right? He asks, he quotes the Bible. He talks about this idea of the country as a spiritual country, but he is there to reaffirm and to emphasize America's strength, right? So one of ours was the first society openly to define itself in terms of both spirituality and of human liberty. It is a unique self-definition that gives us an exceptional appeal, but it is also imposes on us a special obligation to take on those moral duties which, when assumed, seem invariably to be in our own best interests. Again, sort of redefining that America needs to look out for itself, and America needs to do things to get out of this economic problem and to prevent further problems from happening. So Carter is really, when Carter becomes president in 1970, well, I guess wins the election in 1976, he's really in many ways a backlash to the whole 1970s. Now, Carter's reputation as a president is certainly one that is not particularly great. In many ways, he's had a better post-presidency than he actually ever had a real presidency. But he is, he's an important figure, I think, because he does define sort of, or at least his approach to the 1970s is one that is one of seeing the United States as, he's let me say, he's a more passive figure, and in the late 1970s, he was really the figure that the United States needed. He was a person who came on TV wearing sort of a cozy sweater, and he was sort of, even in the 1970s when he was in his late 50s, was a more of a sort of grandfatherly figure that people could sort of look up to with the white hair and the cozy sweaters. So I think, he was really a figure that the United States needed at the time, although his presidency, again, is one that is generally considered as a failure. I think, again, I think he was what was needed at the time.